The city of Clearwater and two chilling mysteries. Nestled along the southwestern coast of the United States, Clearwater is a gem of a city where the ocean breeze mingles seamlessly with the hum of bustling streets. Known for its picturesque beaches, vibrant economy, and a culture that balanced southern charm with metropolitan ambition, Clearwater had always been the epitome of opportunity and tranquility. It was a place where families came to lay down roots and dream big, where young professionals found their stride, and where tourists were drawn to its glimmering coastline like moths to a flame. By 2010, Clearwater's nickname, the Port of Prosperity, felt more than appropriate. The city's harbor, a hub of commercial trade, was also a bridge to the outside world, connecting cultures, goods, and stories through its busy docks. On any given day, you could find sailors exchanging tales with locals, art vendors setting up colorful displays along the harbor walk, and children chasing seagulls under a sky that rarely seemed anything but blue. This was the Clearwater most people knew, the Clearwater that proudly hosted seafood festivals, live jazz on the pier, and outdoor movie nights under starlit skies. Yet, beneath this postcard-perfect exterior, like any city, Clearwater had its shadows. While its booming industries promised progress, they also brought an influx of transient populations and sprawling neighborhoods, some of which seemed to form overnight. And like ripples in a pond, the city's rapid growth began stirring unease. Crime in Clearwater had always been on the lower side compared to neighboring cities, but by the late 2000s, whispers of theft and unruliness crept into quiet conversations over backyard fences or at local diners. And though citizens were quick to band together for community watches, and police began increasing patrols, nobody could have predicted the storm brewing on the horizon in the form of not one, but two devastating cases that would forever mark Clearwater's history. The first occurred in 2010 and brought about an eerie wave of paranoia that rippled from the city's northern suburbs all the way to its bustling harbor center. The residents, who had prided themselves on their friendly southern openness, suddenly feared for their safety, and just as the city began to rebuild its sense of security, thinking the worst was behind them, an even more harrowing tragedy struck in 2012, one that pulled Clearwater into the national spotlight, its name spoken in newsrooms and living rooms across the country. What made these crimes so chilling wasn't just their brutality but the sheer randomness of it all. Clearwater, a city accustomed to celebrations of life and leisure, had its idyllic surface cracked wide open by the cold realities of these baffling incidents. Why here? Why now? These were the questions that haunted its citizens. For Clearwater, a city of sunsets and seafood, laughter and lightheartedness, these two crimes became an unwelcome dichotomy to its identity. The city that symbolized serenity was now the backdrop of two unspeakable tragedies, sparking conversations about trust, communal vigilance, and above all, the resilience of a community grappling with its own vulnerability. What followed was a gripping journey of dead ends, shocking twists, and an investigation that would push Clearwater's law enforcement to its limits. The disappearance of Jessica, 2010. Jessica Green was the kind of person whose presence lit up any room she walked into. At 28, she was beloved by everyone who knew her, a proud kindergarten teacher who had an uncanny ability to reach her students in ways others couldn't. It wasn't just her engaging teaching style or her perpetual smile that made her memorable, it was her kindness, a trait that seemed to flow effortlessly from her. Whether it was volunteering at the local shelter during school breaks, baking cupcakes for her students' birthdays, or just stopping to greet her elderly neighbors each morning, Jessica's life was a series of moments dedicated to making others feel seen and valued. But on a warm evening in July 2010, Jessica's light was abruptly extinguished. She'd been visiting a friend across town, something she often did this time of year. Summer evenings in Clearwater were iconic. Balmy breezes sweeping inland from the Gulf, sounds of cicadas buzzing like a gentle background symphony, and the kind of amber sunsets that deserved a postcard. Jessica's neighborhood, tucked a few blocks inland from the harbor district, was considered cozy and safe. Little cottages with wraparound porches, picket fences, and a sense of neighborly trust that rarely faltered. That night, Jessica left her friend's house around 9 p.m., waving goodbye and promising they'd meet for coffee the following week. It wasn't a long drive home, about 15 minutes if the traffic lights were kind. Her car had been spotted earlier that evening at one of Clearwater's busier intersections, caught on CCTV as she waited for the light to turn green. But she never arrived home. Her disappearance was alarmingly swift and without a trace. When she didn't show up at school the next morning, her colleagues knew right away that something was wrong. Jessica was dependable to a fault. Missing her scheduled morning literacy workshop wasn't just unusual, it was unthinkable. According to her co-teacher, Jessica would have at least sent a text or called if something had come up. By noon, her absence had raised enough concern for her close friend and roommate Claire to start calling her phone. Each time it rang and rang, but Jessica never picked up. Panic began to set in. That evening, the Clearwater Police Department received its first official missing persons report. Claire's voice trembled as she described Jessica's last known movements on the phone. "She's not the type to just disappear," Claire insisted. But to the police, Jessica seemed to fit a frustratingly common profile, an independent young woman living her life with no ongoing disputes or dangers, who simply vanished into the night. She wasn't estranged from her family, wasn't in debt, and hadn't been seen with any questionable company. It was, in every sense, a mystery. Investigators started by retracing her steps. They spoke to her friend who'd hosted her earlier that evening, combed through the footage captured on the security camera at the intersection, and checked her usual routes home for any signs of her car. Nothing seemed amiss. Jessica's friends and family banded together, canvassing her neighborhood and handing out flyers with her bright, smiling face printed across them. "Have you seen Jessica Green?" the bold font asked. As the days turned to weeks, each lead the police tried to follow seemed to dead end. They received tips that left them chasing ghosts, a supposed sighting of her car on a road outside of Clearwater, a claim from a gas station clerk who thought he'd seen a woman matching Jessica's description filling up her tank 2 cities away. But none of it materialized into anything actionable. Her case gripped the city. News outlets picked up the story, internet forums sprang alive with discussions and theories, and the local community poured out their hearts, organizing candlelight vigils, and continuing to spread awareness in the hopes that she would walk home safely. Jessica's parents, who'd flown in from their small town in Ohio, remained at the forefront, pleading on television. "Jessica, if you're out there, we love you. Please let us know you're safe." Then, on the 7th day after Jessica went missing, Clearwater PD received an unexpected jolt. A local fisherman named Albert Monroe called in. "I don't know what I found out here, but I think you'd better send someone." His voice faltered over the line. He'd been sorting his lines along the edge of a remote section of Clearwater's pristine lake when he spotted something nearby, a metallic glint under the sun, partially obscured by reeds. When officers arrived at the scene, they quickly pulled back vegetation to discover Jessica's car, parked in an area far from her usual route. The vehicle's doors were locked, her purse was still inside the front seat, and chillingly, her phone sat on the passenger's side, battery dead. Investigators quickly grew more alarmed when they checked the surrounding area. Scattered among the brush were faint footprints and small signs of a struggle, a broken bracelet that was later identified as Jessica's favorite silver bangle, given to her by her mother on her 21st birthday. The discovery changed the trajectory of the investigation entirely. This was no ordinary disappearance. Although law enforcement was reluctant to declare foul play just yet, the mounting evidence couldn't be ignored. Jessica wasn't just lost or running away. Something or someone had interrupted her journey, pulling her life into a dark void that no one could yet comprehend. The first clue: the forgotten bracelet. Amid the growing hysteria surrounding Jessica Green's disappearance, the city's police force was operating on overdrive. Every officer, from seasoned detectives to rookies just weeks into the job, was pouring through leads, phone records, and witness testimonies in a frantic attempt to piece together the puzzle. Yet as days passed, the trail seemed to grow colder. Clearwater, a city known for its endless sunshine, began to feel the weight of shadows, metaphorically and literally, as nighttime unease crept into the hearts of its citizens. It wasn't until the 9th day that a glimmer of hope appeared in the form of something simple, small, and easily overlooked: a silver bracelet. The discovery was anything but ordinary. A young officer named David Larkin was tasked with revisiting routes Jessica might have traveled, a long shot at best. Along the edges of Clearwater Harbor, not far from one of the city's many piers, Officer Larkin decided to inspect an old, neglected warehouse. The place had become a sore spot in the community, a crumbling relic of Clearwater's bygone industrial era. With its broken windows and graffiti-streaked walls, it seemed like a place where secrets could easily hide. Larkin didn't expect to find much. Most of the area had already been combed weeks earlier by local search parties, and heavy storms had recently swept through, washing away anything left on the surface. Still, As he navigated through a tangle of overgrown grass and discarded junk, something glimmered briefly in the hazy afternoon light. It caught his eye. He knelt down, brushing aside a pile of damp leaves and debris, and there it was, a silver bracelet, delicate but sturdy. Its surface was slightly scuffed, as though it had been dropped accidentally or perhaps yanked off in a moment of struggle. But what made Larkin's breath catch in his throat weren't the scratches or the way the bracelet seemed out of place, it was the engraving. Barely legible through years of wear and the grime of its surroundings, the bracelet bore the initials JG, Jessica Green. It was a moment where time seemed to stand still. Larkin radioed his discovery immediately, his voice laced with urgency. "Dispatch, I might have something here. A silver bracelet matches the description from Jessica's roommate." Within minutes, detectives descended upon the scene. The bracelet was photographed meticulously before being bagged as evidence, something tangible and real in a case that had, until then, been shrouded in uncertainty. The implications of the bracelet's location were chilling. The abandoned warehouse sat on the fringes of Clearwater's bustling harbor district, a stark contrast between its desolation and the liveliness just blocks away. It was the kind of place you wouldn't want to find yourself alone at night, a place with a reputation for illegal gatherings and the occasional vagrant seeking shelter. For Jessica's bracelet to end up here raised unsettling questions. Had she been brought here? Had she resisted? And most disturbingly, was she still alive when her bracelet was discarded? Scanning the area with renewed determination, the investigators searched for any additional clues, hoping for even the smallest scrap of evidence to explain how the bracelet had ended up there. They found faint impressions in the soft earth near the warehouse's entrance, footprints though too smeared by the rain to be of immediate use. Just feet away, a cigarette butt lay half buried in mud, damp but with possible traces of DNA. The detectives collected it alongside the bracelet, every small piece of evidence feeling like a fragile link in an uncertain chain. The bracelet itself was immediately taken to forensic labs for closer inspection. Investigators hoped for fingerprints, hairs, or any fibers that might point them to a suspect. Weeks earlier, Jessica's roommate Claire had provided a detailed description of the jewelry Jessica often wore, and the bracelet had topped the list. It was a birthday gift from her mother, Claire had explained, something Jessica always wore, whether she was teaching her students or relaxing at home. For Jessica's family, the discovery was bittersweet. On one hand, it was the first tangible clue since her disappearance, a sign that may have brought them closer to answers. But on the other hand, it reinforced their worst fears. Jessica hadn't simply wandered off or gotten lost. Something had happened to her, and someone else was involved. Public speculation, which had already reached fever pitch, exploded with the bracelet's revelation. News outlets were quick to release details, featuring images of similar bracelets alongside headlines urging readers to remain vigilant. Online forums buzzed with armchair detectives, certain they knew what had happened. At the heart of it all, Clearwater's community clung to one desperate hope: that the bracelet wasn't a symbol of tragic finality, but a clue leading to Jessica's rescue, or at least to the truth. But for the detectives on the case, the bracelet opened just as many questions as it answered. How had it come to be abandoned in an area that Jessica had no known connections to? Was it left there as a taunt, a mistake? Or perhaps, as some darker theory suggested, had Jessica been alive and conscious when it fell from her wrist? And if so, where had she gone afterward? The slight comfort that came with finding the bracelet was fleeting. As days stretched on, any new momentum seemed to fizzle. The cigarette butt turned up no hits in the criminal database. The footprints, too distorted from rainfall, led nowhere. Even the bracelet itself yielded little more than what they already knew: it belonged to Jessica. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, just cold metal that hinted at a deeply unsettling story. Despite the lack of breakthroughs, the bracelet remained the core of Clearwater PD's efforts moving forward, a symbol of their determination to find Jessica, no matter the odds. For as bleak as things seemed, it was a glimmer of hope in a case shrouded by shadows. And for Jessica's family, it was a reminder of her spirit, a connection to their daughter that couldn't be erased, no matter how far the darkness stretched. The mysterious death beneath the lake. A week after Jessica Green's disappearance sent shockwaves through Clearwater, a local pastime would inadvertently unravel another piece of the chilling puzzle. Albert Monroe was a lifelong fisherman who had spent nearly every morning of the past 15 years casting his line into Clearwater Lake before the day's heat became unbearable. To him, the lake wasn't just a place, it was a ritual, a sanctuary of mirrors reflecting the endless blue skies above. That July morning wasn't much different. The sunrise was soft and golden, the kind of peaceful rhythmic backdrop that made Clearwater the idyllic town people wanted to call home. But as Albert's fishing boat drifted near the lake's northern edge, a less trafficked portion shaded by towering cypress trees, he noticed something jutting out against the reeds, something that didn't belong. At first he didn't think much of it. Over the years the lake had collected its fair share of debris, lost fishing nets, caps, even rusting soda cans. Albert steered closer, his curiosity tugging him forward. And then he saw it, the unmistakable metallic glint of a car door, dulled beneath cloudy water and dirt. Frozen for a heartbeat, his gut churned with unease. No one came to this part of the lake, not willingly. His shaky hands dialed the Clearwater Police Department immediately. "I don't know what's out here, but you better send someone," he stammered. Detectives and divers arrived within the hour, their vehicles kicking up dust as they hurriedly parked along the rugged bank. Police tape went up quickly while bystanders who had noticed the commotion lined the nearby walking paths, grappling with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Was this Jessica's car? If so, what would they find inside? Answers or more maddening questions? The divers secured their gear and slid wordlessly into the water, the splash muffled against the murmur of onlookers and radio chatter. Clearwater Lake wasn't particularly deep in that area, but the murkiness made visibility an enormous challenge. A full 20 minutes passed before one of the divers surfaced, waving to the officers on shore. "We found something!" he called out, his voice heavy even through the tension-filled air. Jessica Green's car was pulled from the lake with the care of a delicate antique, the crane groaning under the effort as muddy water cascaded from its sides. While it was immediately recognizable as Jessica's sedan, its pale blue paint dirty but intact, it was the discovery within that sent a chill down every spine. Locked in the vehicle's trunk, wrapped in layers of thick weathered rope, was Jessica's lifeless body. The scene silenced even the most stoic members of the task force. Her face, though bloated by the water and dimmed of its vibrant life, was unmistakably Jessica's. She was still dressed in the floral summer dress her roommate Claire had described, the one she'd worn to her friend's house the evening she disappeared. Clinging desperately to formality amidst their grief and shock, detectives moved quickly to secure the scene, cataloging each detail with precision. This was no longer a case of simple disappearance, it was now officially a homicide. The coroner's report in the days that followed shed light, albeit grimly, on Jessica's final moments. She showed no evidence of physical assault or sexual violence, but the signs of struggle were clear. Bruises around her wrists and rope burns on her ankles hinted at a desperate fight against captivity. Her cause of death was ruled as asphyxiation, most likely due to drowning. What devastated the community most was this. The report suggested that Jessica had likely been alive when her car was driven into the lake. Struggling, suffocating, terrified, all in the depths of Clearwater's tranquil waters. News of the discovery reverberated through the city with crushing impact. Clearwater was already teetering on the edge of panic following her disappearance, but now, a collective sense of grief and fear seeped into the daily lives of its residents. Parents insisted their children return home before the streetlights flickered on. Joggers avoided deserted trails near the harbor and the lake. Businesses posted signs reminding customers to be vigilant. Jessica's death had done more than claim the life of someone beloved. It cracked open the facade of safety the city had prided itself on for so long. The investigation intensified almost immediately. Detectives pored over the car, both inside and out, desperate for clues. Jessica's phone was still missing, leaving a frustrating gap in the digital timeline of her final hours. Fingerprints on the trunk latch, a potential breakthrough, were too smudged for any immediate matches. Meanwhile, the rope binding her body became a focal point. It was thick, industrial grade, the kind of material often used in harbors to tie down boats or secure freight. A link to the nearby shipping district seemed inevitable, but Clearwater's docks were sprawling, employed by scores of workers, transients, and visitors. It was a needle in a haystack. Jessica's funeral was held shortly after her recovery, a somber affair that drew attendance from people all across Clearwater. Friends, neighbors, and complete strangers came together at Fairway Community Church to honor her life. The pastor's words, though meant to console, barely reached the ears of many in the pews. For Jessica's parents, their heartbreak was boundless. Their daughter, so full of life, so kind-hearted, was reduced to another victim in a senseless act of violence. Her closest friends, including Claire, could barely process the loss. Candlelit vigils followed over the next several days, with mourners gathering near Clearwater Lake to leave flowers, photos, and messages written on paper lanterns floating across the glassy water. But grief wasn't all that lingered. Suspicion began to creep into conversations across the city. Who could do something like this, and why? Rumors swirled that perhaps Jessica had known her attacker, or that this terrible act was random, a stark and horrifying reminder of how unpredictable the world could be. Local papers speculated endlessly. Some pointed fingers at shadowy corners of the community, while others blamed the city's booming development and its influx of new faces. Online forums buzzed with amateur theories, every thread chasing answers faster than the authorities could confirm them. For Detective Alvarez, head investigator on the case, the weight of the city's eyes felt suffocating at times. Clearwater wasn't just looking for justice. They were looking for reassurance, for proof that their city could still be what it once was. But Alvarez and his team had no easy answers. The lake had given them Jessica, but not her story. Not yet. The stalled investigation. For Detective Alvarez and his team, the first few weeks after Jessica Green's body was discovered were a flurry of activity. Frenzied, desperate, and ultimately, frustrating. Every day seemed to bring a new lead, a witness who thought they'd seen something suspicious near the lake, a rumor about a shadowy figure hanging around the industrial docks, or a tip phoned in by a local who swore they heard whispers of the crime in a bar downtown. But time has a cruel way of sifting hope from reality. One by one, each lead either unraveled under scrutiny or led them to another dead end. Clearwater, once brimming with determination to find Jessica's killer, began to shoulder the heavy silence of unanswered questions. The first major setback was the absence of usable forensic evidence from the crime scene. Although Jessica's car, and her body, seemed to be a treasure trove of potential clues, the truth was far more disappointing. The rope used to bind her wrists and ankles, while determining her likely connection to the Harbor District, was too generic to narrow down a specific source. Clearwater's docks handled dozens of shipments weekly, bringing in ropes, nets, and hardware supplies from all over the region. As for the footprint impressions found near the lake's edge, earlier rainfall had smeared the soil, leaving the patterns too vague for proper analysis or matching. Meanwhile, fingerprints on the car's exterior door handles and trunk latch were a maddening mix of Jessica's and undistinguishable smudges. The cigarette butt discovered near the abandoned warehouse, the one place they had found her bracelet, was sent off to labs with high hopes. DNA testing revealed it did not belong to Jessica, but Clearwater's law enforcement database yielded no matches to known offenders either. The investigative team wondered time and time again, did the killer know how to cover their tracks, or were they simply lucky? Even Jessica's missing phone, a valuable piece of the puzzle, proved elusive. Detectives spent weeks combing through local pawn shops and online resale platforms, bracing for the chance it was left behind by a careless perpetrator. Every possibility, however, ended up being another ghost chase, another blind alley. Neither Jessica's digital records nor her physical possessions offered the answers the team so desperately sought. The community tried to help, at first. Jessica Green's lovely smile, frozen in school photos and vigil posters, haunted news broadcasts and the front pages of Clearwater's papers. The question, "Who killed Miss Green?" was on everyone's lips at church gatherings, supermarket lines, and coffee counters. But after weeks of little progress, public interest couldn't help but wane, and whispers turned into an aching silence. Vibrant flyers, once pinned on every bulletin board and lamppost, began to curl and fade under the blistering Florida sun. It wasn't long before many of Clearwater's residents braced themselves for the worst. Perhaps Jessica's killer would never be caught. For Jessica's parents, the slow crawl of the investigation felt especially cruel. They had remained in Clearwater after her funeral, staying at her friend Claire's house, hoping to bring their daughter justice. Jessica's mother tried to distract herself by cooking large meals for her daughter's closest friends, many of whom had joined the community volunteer efforts early on. But quiet moments, the seconds when she thought no one was watching, revealed her grief and anger. Why Jessica? Why had no one seen or heard anything that night? She vented these questions often to her husband, whose stoicism was beginning to crack beneath the weight of his own helplessness. Detective Alvarez too felt the sting of failure. Clearwater had seen its share of crimes over the years, petty thefts, feuds that escalated into violence, the rare but horrifying domestic abuse case, but never something this brazen, this tragic. It wasn't only the brutality of Jessica's death that clung to the hearts of her neighbors. it was the lack of clarity. There'd been no sign of struggle in her daily life, no inappropriate figures circling her world, no secrets lurking behind the curtains of her otherwise ordinary existence. This crime, there was no reason for it. Not one. The investigation team met daily in the muggy precinct headquarters, laying out evidence across whiteboards and pinning photos to corkboards like pieces of an unsolvable jigsaw puzzle. Jessica's route on the night of her disappearance was mapped out 100 times, with every alternate street and turn-through explored. Still, no new insight emerged. At night, Alvarez drowned in thoughts of what they might have missed. He reviewed case notes until the words blurred together, each paragraph feeling like the same inconclusive refrain. No suspect identified, no motive established. Pressure from the media didn't help either. Some local reporters called out Clearwater PD, accusing them of mishandling evidence or devoting insufficient resources to the case. Though untrue, these claims became flashes of tabloid fodder, sparking frustration throughout the department. Alvarez was no stranger to scrutiny, but the Jessica Green incident had become deeply personal for him. He wasn't just chasing a killer, he was chasing closure for Jessica's parents, for her co-workers, for the children she used to teach. He was chasing a fragile sense of safety that the Clearwater community had lost and might never recover. As summer turned to fall, the emotional strain began to affect everyone involved. Officers who had once volunteered for every shift on Jessica's case began looking visibly exhausted. Family members of the investigative team quietly admitted guilt. Was their husband or wife spending too many nights at the precinct, failing to come home before their own kids went to bed? Harder still was responding to public skepticism, clearing out tips from vocal conspiracy theorists who claimed a government cover-up was underway or chasing wild hunches that someone spotted Jessica's ghost by the pier. The case wasn't closed, not officially, but it felt frozen. Entire weeks passed without meaningful updates, leaving Jessica's family in a limbo that defied ordinary grief. It was in this void, this aching lack of resolution, that the city of Clearwater collectively held their breath. Was it only the beginning of more unthinkable crimes to come? Or was Jessica's case destined to remain a cold file, another tragic story without an ending? Despite the despair, there were still candles lit at vigils. Every so often, small groups gathered by Jessica's favorite park bench to share whispered prayers or moments of silence. Clearwater hadn't fully given up, not yet. There was a fragile hope that somewhere, quietly hidden in the cracks of this sprawling puzzle, an answer waited, and Detective Alvarez had every intention of finding it, even if it took years. The second case, the disappearance of young Emma, 2012. By the summer of 2012, Clearwater was beginning to show signs of healing, or at least pretending to. 2 years had passed since Jessica Green's tragic disappearance and murder. Her case, unresolved and still haunting, had faded from the front pages of newspapers, but never from the minds of those who called Clearwater home. It became a cautionary tale whispered about in quiet moments, one that parents would use to warn their teenagers to be home before dark, or that joggers recalled whenever they felt the prickle of anxiety on one of the city's more isolated trails. It seemed life had started to return to normal, or as close to normal as a town marked by tragedy could ever be. But tragedy wasn't done with Clearwater. It was in August of 2012, a sweltering sticky summer condemned by days of unrelenting heat waves. Emma Cross, just 19 years old, had recently completed her first year of college and returned to Clearwater for the summer break. Unlike many of her peers, she didn't seem eager to escape her hometown once classes were over. Clearwater had always been her orbit, her safe haven. She lived in a modest ranch house with her parents on the south side of the city, just a few miles from the bay. Described by her friends as bubbly and unstoppable, Emma had a knack for making even the dullest hangout memorable. She was the kind of person who lit up group chats with too many GIFs, showed up to birthdays with handmade, heartfelt gifts, and somehow managed to get even her most cynical friends singing along to throwback pop songs during late-night drives. Emma had ambition too. She dreamed of becoming a marine biologist, studying the ecosystems right off the Gulf Coast. On the night of August 15th, Emma had made plans to attend a house party hosted by an old high school friend. It was a casual gathering, one of the last before summer break ended and people returned to their routines. She dressed lightly, wearing a simple sundress with her favorite charm necklace, a small silver seashell her dad had given her as a good luck token when she left for college the year before. Her parents didn't think twice when Emma left the house at 7 p.m., promising to be back by midnight. Clearwater was small, familiar, and safe, though the lingering uncertainties from Jessica Green's murder still floated beneath the community's surface. Still, Emma wasn't a reckless girl. She didn't drink much, and always had someone walk her to her car if an event ran too late. That night the party was everything she'd expected. Nostalgic, loud, and warm with the energy of longtime friendships. Emma laughed, danced, and shared stories with friends she hadn't seen in months. Pictures from that night, later posted to social media, showed her mid-laugh, holding a plastic cup of soda, her charm necklace catching the porch light. Everything seemed fine. Ordinary. But ordinary was about to take a dark turn. Around 11:30 p.m., Emma texted her best friend Carrie. "Heading out soon, see you before school starts." It was the kind of text anyone might send after a good night, full of plans for a future all too easily taken for granted. Cameras positioned at a traffic light a block away from the party caught her car leaving the neighborhood shortly after midnight. And then, she was gone. By the following morning, Emma's parents were anxious. Midnight had come and gone without so much as a text from their daughter. They reasoned to themselves that Emma was responsible enough not to text and drive. Maybe she'd stayed over at the party after getting too tired. Maybe her phone had died. They called her several times, leaving voicemail after voicemail. By 9 a.m. their worry had turned into panic. Around noon they called Clearwater Police to report Emma missing. At first, officers approached the situation cautiously. After all, young adults sometimes extended nights out without letting their parents know. But as Emma's family continued to insist that this was entirely unlike her, the police began taking the case more seriously. By 3 p.m., patrols were dispatched to retrace her last known movements. The first lead was the party she had left. No one there had seen or heard from her since she waved goodbye around midnight. For Clearwater, the parallels to Jessica Green's disappearance were too glaring to ignore. The town had barely recovered from the first tragedy, and now another young woman seemed to have vanished into the same endless summer night. As news of Emma's disappearance spread, a sense of déjà vu rippled across the community, turning street talk into a combination of panic and dread. Police widened their search, focusing first on the stretch of road Emma took toward her home. Traffic cameras showed her car entering town, but lost track of it just 15 minutes later, at a poorly lit intersection heading toward Clearwater's outskirts. It was as though she'd disappeared into thin air just like Jessica. Flyers bearing Emma's face joined Jessica's on lampposts and bulletin boards, haunting reminders that Clearwater's sense of security had been shattered once again. As the hours turned to days, suspicion and theories blossomed. The media descended upon Clearwater with vigor, broadcasting stories of yet another young woman abducted under mysterious circumstances. Some speculated that the two cases were connected. Could Jessica's unsolved murder have emboldened a copycat killer, or worse, an undetected serial predator? Emma's friends poured their grief into action, scouring neighborhoods, putting up missing posters, and retracing her potential routes with flashlights and tired eyes. Candlelight vigils were held in parks and outside Clearwater High School, where Emma had once been a star swimmer. Her mother pleaded through shaking tears during a press conference. "If someone knows where Emma is, please, we beg you, help us bring our daughter back home. Please." The officers leading Emma's case felt the weight of both her disappearance and the unsolved mystery of Jessica Green. Every dead end felt heavier than the last. Detective Alvarez, already haunted by his inability to bring Jessica justice, took the new case personally. He poured his exhaustion and frustrations into searching for answers, but none came. As the weeks passed, Clearwater succumbed to a terrifying reality. Perhaps Emma's story would follow the same chilling trajectory as Jessica's, with more questions than answers trailing behind her absence. A breakthrough, the strange photo on social media. The search for Emma Cross had stretched into weeks, and with each passing day, hope began to wither. Clearwater, still reeling from Jessica Green's unresolved case, felt the weight of another ghost, a vibrant young woman whose absence left a hollow ache in the community. Flyers with Emma's bright smile were plastered across town, but the once bustling search parties had dwindled. Tips had slowed to a trickle, and every lead seemed to crumble as officers tried to pin down even the faintest thread to follow. It was as if Emma had simply evaporated into the humid Florida air. But then came the photo. It was an otherwise ordinary Thursday when Carrie Evans, Emma's best friend, scrolled through her social media feed during an idle moment. Emma's disappearance had consumed Carrie since the night she vanished. Sleep had become a rare luxury, and her days were spent helping Emma's parents, retracing steps and pleading for updates. That night, though, as Carrie swiped through her apps, something strange stopped her cold. Buried among an endless stream of selfies, vacation snapshots and memes was a photo posted by an anonymous account with no profile picture and a cryptic username. The account had seemingly been created just days earlier. The photo was blurry, almost as though it had been intentionally distorted, but it was enough to catch Carrie's breath in her throat. The image showed a hand, posing on some sort of dirty metal surface, and on that hand was a ring. Not just any ring, Emma's ring. Carrie recognized it instantly. The vintage silver band with a small opal stone was Emma's favorite piece of jewelry, a treasured heirloom passed down from Emma's late grandmother. She wore it almost religiously, and Carrie had seen it countless times glinting in the sunlight as Emma gestured animatedly during their conversations. There was no mistaking it. That ring wasn't something you could find randomly in a jewelry store. The caption below the photo read, "Pretty things find lost homes." A chill ran down Carrie's spine as she stared at the photo, her fingers trembling as they moved to take a screenshot. She immediately called Emma's parents, her voice hurried and panicked as she explained what she had found. Within minutes, the family alerted Clearwater Police, with Detective Alvarez himself stepping in to investigate this disturbing new clue, the social media trail. The anonymous post stirred a frenzy. Alvarez convened his team immediately, tasking their tech specialists to trace the IP address and creation date of the account. With its generic handle, no followers and only a single upload, the eerie photo featuring Emma's ring, the account seemed deliberately designed to taunt or mislead. But who and why? The first hours after discovering the post were a whirlwind. Detectives scoured the site, sending urgent subpoenas to the platform's administrators. The anonymous account had been created just 2 days prior and accessed sporadically from different devices. The shifting data trail made it clear the person behind the account was careful, likely aware of how to stay hidden. What made things worse was how the post went viral just hours after Carrie shared it with the wider community. Once local news stations picked up the story, internet sleuths and amateur investigators descended on the cryptic photo like vultures on a fresh clue. There were all kinds of interpretations, theories splintering off into wild directions. Some hypothesized that it was a cruel joke by a prankster wanting to capitalize on the tragedy. Others pointed out the visible grime in the photo, speculating it might have been taken near Clearwater's industrial areas or the long-defunct rail yard that bordered the bay. While much of the online speculation bordered on the absurd, one forum even suggested it was a coded message from Emma herself. Detective Alvarez couldn't shake the sense that the photo was deliberate. The ring was unmistakably Emma's. What wasn't clear was how it had ended up in the image, and why the poster had shared it. Was it someone trying to help the case, or someone connected to her disappearance? Following the clue, forensics analyzed every detail of the photograph, pixel by pixel. The hand in the image, slender and pale, didn't look like it belonged to Emma, further deepening the mystery. From the background, faint textures suggested the surface might be an industrial table, worn down by time and rust. Detectives started cross-referencing known locations around Clearwater that might fit, but it was a daunting task. The city's growth had left many areas abandoned, warehouses, shipping yards, old mills, all ripe for someone to stash secrets. Meanwhile, Alvarez tasked his team with canvassing an area that had surfaced in tips before, Lakeside Ridge Park, located just beyond the outskirts of Clearwater. It was a known hangout spot for teenagers, but also featured unused picnic shelters, wooded trails, and places easy to disappear into. Having shown up in past clues without a clear connection, it now became a higher priority site for searches. As a team swept the park late one evening, their flashlights illuminated a path rarely used by joggers or visitors. Deep into the trail, near the farthest edge of the park, they stumbled upon something partially buried in the dry brush, something that gave the impression of having been hurriedly discarded. What lay there was chilling, a charred, partially burned piece of fabric, the burnt cloth. The fabric was later identified as a torn scarf, scorched and nearly unrecognizable. Detectives sent it immediately to the lab for clues, DNA, any trace evidence left behind from whoever had burned it. While waiting for results, they revisited the context of the ring photo. The scarf's location placed it several miles from Emma's last known location that night, but disturbingly within proximity to older, abandoned infrastructure. The days stretched on, each one laced with anxiety, as detectives tried to verify whether this latest clue would lead them closer to Emma or become yet another bitter dead end. Haunting questions. For the residents of Clearwater, and Emma's family, the photo became a symbol of both nausea-inducing hope and dread. Someone out there had not only Emma's ring but also the sheer audacity to flaunt it. Was this a cruel twist in an already painful story, or was it someone desperate to draw attention to the truth? The anonymous account was eventually traced to a disposable phone purchased from a gas station weeks earlier, but the owner had left no trail behind. Footage from the gas station cameras yielded a silhouette but no identification, a ghost operating in the shadows of the investigation. Still, the photo had sparked interest anew in Emma's disappearance, and it wasn't the last breadcrumb the case would uncover. With the scarf linking Emma's disappearance to yet another location, Detective Alvarez remained convinced they were closing in, closer than ever before on exposing the secrets Clearwater desperately wanted to forget. The shocking discovery: the killer's lair. The hunt for Emma Cross was beginning to feel eerily familiar. Agonizing dead ends, cryptic clues that led nowhere, and a growing sense of dread that the case might remain as unresolved as Jessica Green's. Detective Alvarez knew better than most what was at stake. Clearwater was still haunted by the unanswered horrors of Jessica's death, and Emma's disappearance, her vibrant life abruptly disrupted, sat heavy upon the already tormented community. But just as hope seemed to fade again, an unexpected revelation breathed life back into the investigation. It started with the scarf. The charred piece of fabric uncovered at Lakeside Ridge Park had been sent to the lab weeks earlier. Alvarez had lost count of how many burned or deteriorating objects they had tested over the years, often yielding nothing but frustration. But this time, it was different. Analysts retrieved partial DNA from the fibers that didn't belong to Emma, but matched a previously unidentified profile scattered across other pieces of evidence: the cigarette butt from the abandoned warehouse where Jessica's bracelet had been found, the smudges near Jessica's car. A pattern was forming, faint yet undeniable. But the breakthrough came from something more mundane. As detectives reviewed overlooked details again and again, one of Alvarez's team members, Officer Larkin, the same sharp-eyed officer who had discovered Jessica's bracelet, noticed something strange. The pattern on the scarf, still faintly visible despite the burns, was an exact match for a scarf listed in a missing persons report from 6 years earlier. That case, the disappearance of a local waitress named Laura Pierce, had gone cold long before Alvarez joined the Clearwater department. While overlooked by many during Emma's investigation, this detail suddenly cast a chilling light on what they were dealing with. "Detective," Larkin had said, holding the report in one hand and a magnified photo in the other, "this isn't just about Emma or Jessica. I think we're missing something bigger. Something—" he hesitated, his voice dropping. "Something planned." The crumbling abandoned hut. Armed with the DNA profile and the eerie connection to Laura Pierce, Alvarez ordered a deeper search of the areas near Lakeside Ridge Park. Multiple testimonies from locals had pointed to one location in particular, a decrepit, abandoned caretaker's shack on the far edge of the park, hidden deep within an overgrown thicket. Once part of a now non-functional campground, the structure had been largely forgotten, left to decay in the humid Florida wilderness. While officers had walked nearby during early searches, it was easy to miss, and its isolation made it an ideal hiding place. A team was dispatched at dawn. Their approach was slow and cautious, the rising sun casting long shadows over the dense trees that surrounded the area. As they drew closer to the shack, a creeping sensation of unease settled over the officers. The building sagged under its own weight, its roof caved in on one side, rusted nails jutting from the crooked doorframe. The air around it was oddly still, as if even the birds knew better than to linger. "Stay sharp, everyone!" Alvarez barked, motioning for the officers to fan out around the structure. They entered with weapons drawn, the wooden floor creaking beneath every step. The interior was just as desolate as the outside, a single room filled with decades of dust, broken furniture, and the pungent smell of mildew. But what initially seemed like nothing more than the wreckage of time soon revealed itself to be something far more sinister. In one corner of the shack, beneath a pile of tattered tarps, officers uncovered a rusted metal chest. When the lid creaked open, it exposed a collection of personal belongings, weathered photographs turned gray with age, locks of hair tied with string, and a series of trinkets, a bracelet, a keychain, a shell necklace, all logged and dated with meticulous precision. The realization hit Alvarez like a punch to the gut. "These aren't random," he muttered, his voice grim. "These were trophies. A secret hidden world." As investigators fanned out to check the rest of the crumbling shack, the discoveries only grew darker. Nailed to the walls were faint scratches, words, names, and erratic phrases written into the wood. A broken table had been repurposed into what the forensic team later identified as a workspace, its surface scattered with old zip ties, heavy-duty gloves, and several rolls of industrial-grade rope. Everything about the shack spoke of planning, control, and a chilling obsession. And then there was the drawer. In a splintered dresser partially hidden by debris, one officer found a lockbox. Inside was the most damning evidence yet: Emma's phone. Though the battery was dead, it still showed her home screen, a photo of her and Carrie smiling under the Clearwater sunset. Also in the box were Jessica's earrings from that fateful night in 2010, and a photograph of Laura Pierce in her uniform, torn along the edges as if handled too many times. Alvarez's chest tightened as he handed the items to a nearby technician. His mind raced. Whoever had done this wasn't just operating randomly. This man, he knew it was a man, he could feel it, had been watching, planning, choosing. Every victim had been marked in some way, their belongings stolen and kept as grotesque mementos. "This is his lair," he said aloud, the weight of the words sinking like a stone, piecing it together. The DNA collected from the shack, combined with the evidence inside, made one thing clear. Clearwater wasn't dealing with a sporadic monster. They were facing someone systematic, someone who had evaded justice for years. Forensics uncovered newer evidence too. Recent footprints, food wrappers, and cigarette butts suggested the killer had been in the shack within the past few days. He had returned, possibly even while officers searched nearby, confident that his hiding place was untouchable. But Alvarez suspected that confidence would be the killer's undoing. Detectives wasted no time running the DNA through national databases again, finally yielding a match. Louis Drake, a 41-year-old former dock worker with a history of aggressive behavior and a past peppered with minor charges: trespassing, harassment, petty theft. Though he'd flown under the radar for years, Drake had been quietly fired from the Clearwater Harbor 2 years prior after accusations of stalking a female co-worker. With adrenaline surging through the team, they tracked his last known whereabouts to a small rental property near the industrial district. Clearwater PD prepared for what they hoped would be the takedown that brought justice to Emma, Jessica, and whoever else had fallen prey to his twisted psyche. A city holds its breath. For the citizens of Clearwater, the discovery of the shack sent shockwaves through the community. News spread quickly, the ominous phrase "killer's lair" igniting a media firestorm. Families locked their doors earlier than ever, fearing the unknown, while reporters swarmed the outskirts of Lakeside Ridge Park. Through it all, the lingering question hung like a dark cloud. How many others had disappeared unnoticed? Alvarez wasn't done. He knew finding the lair was just the beginning. If they wanted to bring true justice to their town, they couldn't stop until Louis Drake and his secrets were completely unearthed. The revelation of the killer. The discovery of the decrepit shack in Lakeside Ridge Park marked a turning point in the case. For Detective Alvarez and his team, the evidence found within had begun to close the gap in a puzzle years in the making. The trophies, the scratched names on the walls, and the chilling presence of Emma's phone confirmed their greatest fear. Jessica Green was not an isolated tragedy, nor was Emma Cross. They had been chosen by a predator hiding in their midst. Now they had a name: Louis Drake, and Clearwater's nightmare was no longer a shadow but a man they could finally pursue. Louis Drake wasn't entirely unknown to Clearwater police. His file, though thin, was littered with warning signs. Aged 41, Drake was a former dock worker at Clearwater Harbor, a man who had floated just outside of trouble long enough to avoid major repercussions. His former employers noted his temperamental behavior, often describing him as quiet but unnerving. He had been fired 2 years prior after a female co-worker filed a complaint accusing him of following her to her car after shifts and leaving unsettling notes on her locker. Though the department had investigated, nothing concrete had tied Drake to the allegations, and he'd disappeared shortly after being dismissed. But it wasn't just his employment record that made Detective Alvarez's stomach churn. A deeper dive into Drake's life revealed a more disturbing pattern. He had lived in Clearwater for nearly a decade, renting a series of rundown apartments near the industrial district. Neighbors often described him as reclusive, a man who seldom left his home during daylight hours and appeared at night to wander between the docks and the edge of the harbor. One neighbor, interviewed by police years earlier in connection to a separate complaint, had said, "He's the kind of guy who makes you nervous for no reason. You'd look at him, and his eyes, they don't match his face, you know, like he's thinking about something you don't want to know." Tracking Louis Drake with Drake's DNA tied to the evidence in the shack, the police pieced together his potential movements. His last known address was listed as a cramped unit above an auto repair shop downtown, a location he had seemingly abandoned 6 months earlier. Past landlords described him as unremarkable but strange, often paying rent in cash and avoiding interaction. Alvarez's team quickly issued a nationwide alert, tagging him as a person of interest in both Jessica Green's and Emma Cross's cases. The hunt for Drake intensified, and Clearwater PD coordinated with state and federal law enforcement agencies to track his whereabouts. Surveillance footage from bus terminals, gas stations, and convenience stores across Florida was combed through meticulously. Perhaps the biggest break came when a tip suggested Drake had been spotted purchasing supplies at a hardware store just one town over. A receipt, recovered later, revealed gloves, rope, duct tape, and flashlights among the items purchased, a list as horrifying as it was telling. But Drake was no fool. He knew the police were closing in. Attempts to triangulate his location based on cell tower pings proved fruitless. Drake had discarded his primary phone, likely knowing it could be used to trace him. His evasive tactics suggested not only intelligence but a deeply methodical mind. He wasn't just running, he was disappearing. The standoff. After days of silence and mounting frustration, a crucial tip came in from a truck driver passing through Sarasota, 2 hours south of Clearwater. The driver reported seeing a man matching Drake's description walking along a back road near an abandoned cannery at the edge of town. The property, long unused and overgrown, fit the profile of a place Drake might seek refuge. Alvarez and his team immediately mobilized, assembling a tactical unit to approach the site. As the officers closed in on the cannery, tension hung thick in the air. The sun had begun to set, casting an eerie orange glow over the rusted metal structure and its surrounding fields. Alvarez, standing outside the perimeter with binoculars in hand, watched as shadows moved faintly beyond the shattered windows. "We've got movement," he whispered into his radio. The tactical team advanced cautiously, their boots crunching against gravel as they surrounded the building. Inside, the structure was a labyrinth of decrepit machinery and rotting beams, a fitting hideout for a man who thrived in darkness. Alvarez led from the rear, his heart pounding as the team breached the entrance. "Clear the right!" someone called out. "Check the upper level!" Alvarez's voice cut through the tension. "If you see him, do not engage alone!" And then, they saw him. Drake stood near the farthest corner of the building, his back to the officers, his frame rigid against the dim light slipping through broken panes. He was holding something in his hands, a small crumpled photo. When he turned, it was clear he was ready for them. His face was hollow, eyes sunken but sharp, and his demeanor eerily calm. "What's the matter, detective?" he asked, his voice low but carrying. "Finally figured me out?" "The arrest." The standoff stretched into agonizing minutes. Drake didn't run, nor did he resist. Instead, he seemed to bask in the moment, holding the tension like a conductor before a crescendo. "You think putting cuffs on me is going to erase what I've done?" he sneered, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "You're looking at something you can't write off, detective, something bigger than you." Alvarez stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Louis Drake, you're under arrest for the kidnappings and murders of Jessica Green, Emma Cross, and Laura Pierce," he said firmly. "This ends here." Drake tilted his head, his smile unwavering. "Ends? No, detective, this is just the beginning." The team moved quickly, subduing Drake and placing him in handcuffs. As they escorted him outside, the oppressive quiet of the cannery gave way to the distant hum of police radios and the chatter of officers exchanging exclamations of relief. But for Alvarez there was no sense of triumph. Not yet. There were still too many questions, too many victims unaccounted for, piecing together the monster. Over the days that followed Drake's arrest, interviews and interrogations peeled back the layers of his twisted mind. He admitted to stalking Jessica Green for weeks before her disappearance, watching her leave school and return to her home, waiting for the perfect moment. When pressed about Emma, his response was chilling. "She was different," he said, almost proud. "She reminded me of someone and I couldn't let her go." Drake's calculated confessions gave investigators insight into his methods, how he would select his victims, study their routines, and isolate them in moments of vulnerability. Yet, he refused to admit to murdering Laura Pierce, instead smirking and saying, "You'll figure it out eventually." Beyond confessions, physical evidence sealed the case against Drake. Fibers from the rope used on Jessica and Emma matched samples found in his shack. DNA under Emma's fingernails confirmed her desperate struggle. The trophies in his possession, a shell bracelet, a scarf, a pair of earrings, were undeniable proof of his obsession. A community in shock for Clearwater, Drake's arrest brought a strange mix of relief and despair. The boogeyman who had haunted their town for years was no longer in the shadows, but the scars of his crimes lingered. Vigils for Jessica and Emma were held once again, this time in bittersweet honor of their memory and the justice that had finally begun to take shape. And for Alvarez, the nightmare wasn't over. "We've got him," he said in a press briefing, his tone resolute yet weary. "But this isn't about closure, it's about accountability, for every victim we know and for those we may never find." As Drake awaited trial, the weight of his axe hung heavy over Clearwater. A town that had long prided itself on small-town charm now understood the dark truth. No place, no matter how peaceful, is ever truly safe. The chilling confession. Louis Drake sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the steel table and his face expressionless. The overhead fluorescent light flickered faintly, casting sharp shadows over his gaunt, hollow features. Despite the weight of his crimes, there was no sign of remorse. He leaned back slightly in his chair, staring at the observing glass as though savoring the attention he was finally receiving. Detective Alvarez sat across from him, silent for a long moment, studying the man who had haunted his thoughts for years. Despite everything Alvarez had seen in this line of work, the desperation, the rage, the broken lives, there was something unnervingly different about Louis Drake. He wasn't one of the unpredictable, reckless petty criminals the team often dealt with. No, Drake was methodical, serene even, like he had prepared for this day as meticulously as he had planned his crimes. "Let's not waste time, Louis," Alvarez began, his voice steady but edged with the frustration of years spent chasing answers. "You're already caught, there's no escape, so tell me, was it for thrill, control, revenge? Why Jessica? Why Emma? Why any of them?" Drake tilted his head, the faintest smirk forming. "Control?" he echoed, as if tasting the word. "It's not as simple as that, detective." He let the word hang in the air, savoring the tension. When Alvarez didn't respond, Drake continued, his voice calm and deliberate. "You're looking at this all wrong. You think there's some deep, dark explanation, but honestly there's not. Sometimes people like me, we just are." The sheer casualness of his admission sent a chill through Alvarez's chest. He didn't flinch, didn't let the disgust or anger surface, but he leaned in slightly, his sharp eyes locked on Drake's. "You're saying there's no reason, no rhyme, you just woke up one day and decided to hunt these women?" Alvarez asked, his voice low, his patience wearing thin. Drake chuckled softly, the sound eerily devoid of warmth. "Hunt," he repeated, as if amused by the word. "You make it sound so primitive, detective. It wasn't like that. They weren't my prey." He paused, his gaze flickering toward the observing glass for just a moment. "No, Jessica was predictable, normal. That's what intrigued me. She walked the same path every day, trusted too easily. People like her always believe the world's a safe place until—" He snapped his fingers. "It's not." Alvarez suppressed a shiver, keeping his voice calm. "You didn't just take her life, Louis. You shattered an entire community. You destroyed her family. So what? Was it about power? Did you feel invincible, hiding in the shadows?" Drake leaned forward slightly, his smirk fading, his expression becoming solemn in a way that was somehow even more unsettling. "It wasn't about power. Jessica was a test," he said after a long pause. "A warm-up, I guess you could say. I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it, that I could take someone who mattered, someone people loved, and erase them, like a whisper in the wind." The bluntness of his words hit Alvarez like a gut punch, but he didn't let it show. He scribbled something down on his pad, his hand trembling only slightly. "And Emma Cross? Was she just another test to you?" A flicker of something flashed in Drake's eyes. It wasn't remorse. No, it was almost pride. "Emma was special," he said quietly. "Different." He leaned back in his chair again, seemingly lost in thought, his words now slower, more deliberate. "She reminded me of someone who ignored me, dismissed me, laughed at me when I was younger. You see, detective, Emma wasn't just someone I picked randomly. She triggered something personal." "Personal?" Alvarez's voice sharpened. "Are you saying Emma reminded you of someone, or that you knew her?" Drake chuckled again, the sound hollow. "Emotions, detective. You're reaching for something too neat, too human." He clicked his tongue. "Emma didn't deserve it, necessarily, but then again, who does? She had a light about her, though. It irritated me. Bright people like her, they act like the world owes them something, like they're untouchable." "You stole her life because her light irritated you?" Alvarez snapped, his voice cutting through the still room like a blade. He rarely lost his temper, but this was something different. To hear Drake reduce Emma's life, her dreams, her family, her friends, to a mere nuisance was almost too much to bear. Drake raised his cuffed hand slightly in mock surrender. "You're making me sound heartless, detective," he said coolly. "You are heartless," Alvarez hissed. "You abducted, terrorized, and killed young women who trusted this world to be fair, to be safe. You left their families to piece together lives that will never be whole again. So forgive me if I don't think there's a philosophical explanation here, Lewis." For the first time Drake's smirk faltered, replaced with something darker. Annoyance, perhaps. "You think you understand it all, don't you?" he said, his voice dropping dangerously. "This case, me, their suffering. But here's the thing, detective, your outrage, your little moral speeches, they're just noise." He leaned forward as far as his cuffs would allow, locking eyes with Alvarez. "You didn't catch me because you're smart. You didn't catch me because you're a hero. You caught me because I wanted to be caught. I've been pulling strings in your little town for years, and you barely noticed." Alvarez felt the thrill of rage bubble inside him, but he buried it deep. "You didn't pull the strings, Drake. You're just a small man playing God in a town that's finally caught up to you." Drake smirked again, but it lacked the confidence it had moments before. Silence fell between them for several minutes, the only sound being the faint hum of the fluorescent light above. Neither man shifted, neither man broke eye contact. Finally, Alvarez rose from his chair, gripping his pen tightly between his fingers. "You'll never get the satisfaction you think you deserve, Lewis," he said firmly. "These women, Jessica, Emma, Laura, and whoever else you hurt, they're not your trophies, not your puppets. They're victims you underestimated. And we're not going to stop until every single truth about what you've done sees the light of day." Drake said nothing, his smug grin slipping into a blank, unreadable stare. Alvarez turned and left the room without another word. The aftermath of the confession. Drake's chilling confession, his casual dismissal of life, his macabre justifications, shook the Clearwater PD to its core. Officers accustomed to domestic disputes and small-town misdemeanors found themselves grappling with something far darker than they had ever imagined. The media seized on every detail, painting Drake as the perfect monster, intelligent, calculating, and entirely devoid of guilt. News stations replayed his eerie words, while amateur analysts dissected his personality online. Was he born evil? Was it his upbringing? Everyone had a theory, but none of them could undo the damage Drake had caused. For Alvarez, the confession felt far from a victory. Drake's words haunted him, especially his refusal to show remorse, or even a flicker of genuine emotion. He wasn't motivated by money, revenge, or a hunger for fame. He had simply done it because he could. And for Alvarez, a man who had dedicated his life to understanding crime and protecting the innocent, that explanation was the hardest to swallow. The people of Clearwater, too, struggled with the weight of Drake's revelations. The safety they had once taken for granted now seemed like a distant memory. Doors were locked a little earlier. Strangers were met with cautious glances. And in the quiet corners of living rooms across the city, families whispered prayers for the women they had lost, and for the justice they hoped wouldn't falter. Justice is served. The trial of Lewis Drake was one of the most anticipated events in Clearwater's history. By the time court proceedings began in early 2013, the weight of his crimes had transformed from a local tragedy into a national fixation. News outlets from around the country sent reporters to Florida, eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had terrorized a community, stolen innocent lives, and hidden in plain sight for so long. Surprisingly, Drake himself seemed unfazed by the spectacle, sitting calmly in the courtroom as though he were merely an observer in his own story. For the families of Jessica Green, Emma Cross, and others suspected to have been Drake's unidentified victims, there was really no such thing as justice. No matter the jury's verdict, no sentence could bring their daughters, sisters, or loved ones back. But still, they showed up each day in quiet solidarity, dressed in muted shades of gray and black as if to collectively mourn what had been taken from them. They were determined to see Drake held accountable, to hear the truth spoken aloud in a court of law, and to ensure that his face wouldn't just fade away into the shadows from where he had operated. Detective Alvarez, too, was an ever-present figure during the trial. Having led the investigation into Drake's horrific crimes, he sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, unsure if his presence was for professional closure or something deeper. For Alvarez, this case represented a personal battle, a testament to his promise that he would not stop until Clearwater found answers. He had spent months poring over evidence, interrogating witnesses, and chasing leads that led nowhere. Now, as the investigation transitioned to prosecution, he felt both relief and a gnawing anxiety. What if some part of Drake's monstrousness slipped through the cracks? The prosecution begins. The state's case against Louis Drake was chillingly thorough. Prosecuting attorneys presented an avalanche of evidence over the course of nearly a month, a damning matrix that outlined Drake's brutal methods and left little room for doubt. Their arguments opened with a recounting of the discovery at Lakeside Ridge Park, the makeshift lair where detectives unearthed trophies from his victims, including Jessica Green's bracelet and Emma Cross's phone. Forensic experts detailed how advanced DNA testing had tied Louis Drake to the crime scenes. Fibers from the ropes found in his shack matched those used to bind both Jessica and Emma. Soil samples pulled from Drake's shoes matched specific patches of earth near Clearwater Lake, where Jessica's car, and later her body, had been recovered. A psychologist testified, painting a grim portrait of an individual who exhibited traits of a highly calculated, narcissistic sociopath, someone who thrived on control and disdain for human emotion. But the most harrowing moments came during the testimony of the victims' families. Jessica Green's mother stood shaky yet resolute as she described the last time she spoke to her daughter, the excitement in her voice as she prepared for her kindergarten class. Emma's father admitted through tears that he couldn't bring himself to look at photographs of her at Clearwater High. He could only see emptiness now, a void where her bright future had once been. It was a torturous procession of heartbreak laid bare, but it was also necessary. The prosecution wanted the jury to feel the weight of the lives Drake had taken, to understand that these weren't just abstract crimes, they were stories, families, futures obliterated by a man who stared back at them without flinching. Drake's defense, and the unnerving stare. Drake's defense team faced an uphill battle and they knew it. The evidence against their client was overwhelming, the public outcry deafening. Throughout the trial, they focused their strategy on questioning the chain of custody for the trophies found in the shack and raising obscure doubts about the timeline of Drake's movements. Their tactics were predictable and flimsy, but their role wasn't necessarily to win, it was to ensure Drake's rights had been honored so the verdict would stand in the face of any appeal. Drake himself, however, was a different figure entirely. He instructed his lawyers not to attempt an insanity plea, and made no statements in his defense. When asked if he wanted to speak, he responded only with an eerie calm, "You already know what I am." He refused to show remorse, barely acknowledging the testimony of the victims' families, and stared vacantly, or sometimes smirked, during the most damning presentations of evidence. This behavior only solidified the public's view of Drake as a remorseless monster. One juror, later interviewed anonymously, admitted, "It wasn't just the evidence that convinced me, it was him, the way he looked at us like we meant nothing, like he was already somewhere else." The court gallery often held its collective breath during the more unsettling moments, such as when photos from the killer's lair were shown, rows of items catalogued and neatly arranged, each belonging to a victim who would never come home. The most harrowing of all was a picture of Emma Cross's phone powered on for the jury to see. It showed her lock screen, frozen in time with a photo of her and her best friend Carrie, smiling, carefree, radiant, just weeks before she vanished. The verdict. On March 16, 2013, after deliberating for 5 hours, the jury returned with its verdict. The courtroom was silent as each member of the jury was polled individually, confirming their unanimous decision. Guilty, on all counts. Louis Drake was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and unlawful imprisonment. In a secondary hearing, the judge handed down his sentence. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The families and supporters gathered in the courtroom wept quietly as the sentence was read aloud. For them, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice may have been served, but the wounds from Drake's crimes would never truly heal. They would forever feel the absence of their loved ones, the echoes of laughter and dreams cut short by one man's twisted actions. As Drake was escorted out of the courtroom, his face remained treacherously calm, unbothered even by the weight of his lifelong sentence. He turned his head slightly toward the gallery, and for the briefest moment his eyes locked with Detective Alvarez. There was no smirk this time, no trace of superiority, only a blank stare, as if sizing up the man who had chased him into the dark and dragged him into the light. Alvarez felt no satisfaction in the look, only a quiet determination. He had done his duty, but the guilt of years spent chasing ghosts weighed on him. They had stopped Drake, yes, but as Alvarez left the courtroom, he couldn't shake the lingering fear. What if there were others like him, someone else, somewhere out there, watching, waiting? A community finds resilience. In the days and weeks following the trial, Clearwater began the slow process of healing. Vigils were held once more for Jessica and Emma, this time not in desperation but in remembrance. People left flowers, candles and notes by the lake where Jessica had been recovered and along the park trails where Emma used to walk. Local leaders spoke openly about moving forward, about honoring the women's lives by working harder to protect the vulnerable and to foster vigilance in the community. Parents sat their children down, telling them to be careful, to trust their instincts, to always lock their doors. Schools implemented new safety protocols, and volunteer groups began organizing self-defense workshops for young adults. It wasn't about fear, it was about reclaiming a sense of control. Though the scars left by Louis Drake's crimes would never disappear, Clearwater refused to let him define their town. They would move forward together, remembering the lives he had stolen while protecting those still left to live. Hope in the darkness, Clearwater was undeniably scarred, but it had not been defeated. Even in the face of unspeakable tragedy, the community found a way to keep moving forward. It wasn't a matter of forgetting, far from it. Some wounds would never fully heal, and the memories of Jessica Green, Emma Cross and others lost under Louis Drake's shadow would live on in every heart. But through grief and fear, the town began to find fragments of hope, glimmers of light shining through the cracks of its darkest days. For many, hope began with resilience. Families who had once locked their doors in fear started to step back into the world, slowly rebuilding trust in their small but deeply wounded city. Parents walked their children to school, holding their hands a little tighter. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances, each silently encouraging the other to keep faith. Even as shadows of uncertainty hung in the air, Clearwater refused to let those shadows define its future. A community comes together. In the weeks following Louis Drake's conviction, the people of Clearwater came together to honor the lives that he had taken, and to reclaim the sense of safety and unity his crimes had shattered. The first vigil was held just 3 days after the trial ended, near the shores of the same lake where Jessica's car had been discovered all those years ago. It was a mild spring evening, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, hundreds gathered with flickering candles in hand. Jessica's parents, Emma's family, and even the relatives of past victims stood at the forefront, their faces marked with grief, but also with quiet determination. A local pastor led the vigil, speaking not of sorrow but of perseverance, urging the town to remember the victims not for how their lives had ended, but for how beautifully they had lived. "She was a teacher," Jessica's mother said softly, her voice trembling as she addressed the crowd. "Her life was full of light and purpose, and that light didn't go away. It lives here, in all of you, in everyone who refuses to let fear win." That's what Jessica would want, for us to hold on to one another, to protect one another, and to keep that light alive. The crowd fell silent as Emma's father spoke next. He held up a small silver seashell necklace, Emma's treasured charm, a token of her love for the ocean and her dreams of becoming a marine biologist. "This was her dream," he said, his voice breaking. "The ocean, the future, the life she saw ahead of her. She didn't deserve this, but we're not going to let her memory fade. Clearwater is stronger than this darkness. My daughter believed in this town, and so do I." As their words echoed across the still waters of the lake, the crowd lit more candles and set paper lanterns afloat, their soft glow drifting into the night sky and reflecting in the water below. It was a powerful, quiet rebellion against the terror that had gripped Clearwater for too long, restoring strength through unity. The aftermath of Louis Drake's crimes prompted permanent changes in Clearwater. While the trial closed a painful chapter, it also forced the community to re-evaluate how it approached safety and vigilance. Schools implemented new policies like stricter background checks for employees and enhanced security measures around campuses. Local organizations began hosting workshops on self-defense for women and teens, teaching them how to protect themselves and trust their instincts. But more importantly, Clearwater came together in ways it hadn't before. Neighborhood watch programs sprang up in every corner of the city, driven not by fear, but by a shared commitment to safeguarding one another. Strangers became acquaintances, acquaintances became friends, and a culture of mistrust was gradually replaced with one of unity. If someone needed help, it was offered without hesitation. If someone noticed something amiss, a street light out, an unfamiliar face loitering near the park, they spoke up. Clear communication became the town's first line of defense in ensuring an event like this would never happen again. Detective Alvarez often reflected on this shift with mixed emotions. He had spent years chasing the ghost of Louis Drake, haunted by the unanswered questions and the lives that were forever changed by his crimes. But now, watching Clearwater begin to heal, Alvarez found solace in the knowledge that the city had grown stronger in the wake of its darkest hour. He often sat in the precinct late at night, surrounded by case files and old photographs. These days, he no longer saw them as evidence of failure, but as reminders of why he had chosen this line of work in the first place, to bring answers to the unanswered, justice to the broken, and hope to those who had lost faith. Remembering through action. In addition to the cultural changes, a movement to memorialize Jessica, Emma, and the other victims began to take root. A group of local residents partnered with the city council to raise funding for a memorial park, which would stand as both a place of healing and a permanent reminder of the lives lost. The park, later named Clearwater Memorial Gardens, was envisioned as more than just a tribute. It was a sanctuary. Paths weaved through serene groves of oak trees, with benches engraved with the names of the victims placed at peaceful intervals. At the heart of the park, a fountain was built, its cascading waters symbolizing resilience and renewal. Behind the fountain stood a sculpted wall, etched with the words, "In memory of those we lost, and in honor of those who carry their light forward." On its dedication day, the community gathered together once more, this time to celebrate not just survival, but growth. Children ran among the paths, their laughter carrying through the air, and their parents watched with quiet smiles, knowing they were rebuilding something lasting for the next generation. For the next generation. The lessons learned from Clearwater's tragedies became tools for building a safer future. Schools incorporated workshops on personal safety and mental health into their curriculums. Community organizations began prioritizing outreach to marginalized groups, determined to bridge social gaps and make every resident feel seen and valued. Clearwater's leaders worked tirelessly to ensure that the darkness of the past would not repeat itself, and where it threatened, it would be met with vigilance, compassion, and resolve. Emma Cross's younger brother Leo stood at the forefront of these efforts. Once a shy teenager burdened by the loss of his sister, he grew into a passionate advocate for change. Years later he returned to Clearwater after finishing college, founding a non-profit dedicated to promoting public safety and supporting victims of violence. "I couldn't save my sister," he said at the organization's first event, his voice firm yet full of emotion. "But I can make sure the people of this town never feel alone or powerless again." That's what Emma would have wanted. Light beyond the darkness. In time, Clearwater returned to life. This wasn't the same carefree city it had been more than a decade ago. There was a collective understanding now of what had been lost and what it had taken to rebuild. But despite the scars left behind by Louis Drake and the terror he inflicted, Clearwater had found a way to transform fear into strength and grief into action. Every year on the anniversary of Emma's disappearance and Jessica's recovery, the city held a community day of remembrance and hope. People gathered at Clearwater Memorial Gardens to light candles, share stories, and walk the park's paths together. It was a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, hope could and would prevail. Detective Alvarez, retired but still deeply respected in the town, attended these events quietly, standing near the fountain with a bittersweet smile. He no longer carried the weight of the unanswered. It had been replaced by the hope that Clearwater had learned to carry for itself. Even in the darkest places, Alvarez had always believed in one thing above all: light endures, even if it flickers. Clearwater was proof of that.